The Veil called it the reliquary of endings. They dragged it across 17 star systems in a ship the size of a small moon, singing their kill hymns to the dark, and every world they passed went quiet. The way worlds go quiet when something ancient and very patient decides to notice them. Keeldross noticed the ship first. He was sitting in the wreckage of Outpost Fenwick 7 when the long-range array spat out the contact signature, one object, mass anomalous, trajectory, locked on the Oris corridor. He'd been eating a cold tin of something that might have been beans. He set it down on the cracked console without finishing it. That was the first sign for anyone who knew Kale that the situation was serious. He finished his food. He always finished his food. "Run it again," he said. The array ran it again. Same answer. Kale had spent 11 years as a frontier scout for the Terran Expansion Authority, which was a bureaucratic way of saying he went to places that were probably dangerous and returned with reports about how dangerous they were. He had 3 citations for valor, 2 broken orbital bones that had healed slightly wrong, and a reputation among the other scouts for being, in the phrasing of his last supervisor, unnecessarily alive in situations that don't call for it. He was 34 years old and looked 40. He had the kind of face that had forgotten how to be surprised. He looked at the contact signature for a long time. Then he pulled on his coat, picked up the long case beside the console, and walked out into the purple dusk air of Fenwick 7's only continent, dragging the case behind him on its worn strap. It scraped across the dust. The sound was very ordinary. He found, as he often did, that ordinary sounds helped. The reliquary. He'd heard the name once from a Veil defector they'd processed through Waystation Alcott. The defector had given them 17 hours of strategic data, fleet positions, quantum comms frequencies, the biochemical signature of their command class vessels. Useful things. Then, in the last hour, the defector had started talking about the reliquary, and the tone had changed. Something had gone out of the defector's eyes. A clinical detachment that had been there for 17 hours simply wasn't there anymore. The reliquary contains what the Veil call their Stfert voice, the defector had said, the thing that sang creation into being, that was imprisoned by the earliest of their gods for attempting to unmake it. They believe that if the first voice is freed within the forbidden zone, what you call the Oris corridor, it will unmake everything, every atom, every star. That is not a metaphor. That is what they believe will happen. And then the defector had laughed, a small, broken sound. And they are not wrong. Kale had read the transcript of that session twice. He'd flagged the reliquary section. His supervisor had written back, noted, logged, pending review. That had been 3 years ago. The ship was on scope now. The Veil vessel registered as 4.2 kilometers in diameter, angular, armored in their characteristic pale, chitinous plating, moving at a pace that suggested total contempt for any response humanity might mount. They were not rushing. They did not need to rush. Kale set up his camp at the edge of the scorched landing zone. He brewed a cup of coffee from his field kit. He drank it slowly, watching the ship's signature on the portable scope, and thought about the problem. Well, the problem was this. The Veil had the reliquary aboard that ship. The Oris corridor was 9 days' travel at their current speed. The nearest Terran warship was 14 days out. The nearest anything was 14 days out. Because Fenwick 7 was the kind of posting that happened to people who had filed one too many accurate reports about things the authority didn't want accurate reports about. The problem was also this. Kale knew where the corridor's forbidden zone was. He'd mapped it himself 18 months ago on a survey run that had given him 3 weeks of recurring dreams about a place where space went wrong, where light bent in ways that light wasn't supposed to bend, where the instruments suggested an absence not of energy but of something else, something they didn't have a word for. He poured a second cup of coffee. He didn't need it. He poured it anyway. Behind him, in the collapsed east wing of the outpost, something moved. KL did not reach for his weapon. He turned slowly and found himself looking at a child. She was perhaps 7 years old, human. She was standing in the rubble with the perfect stillness of a creature that understood rubble, understood the specific grammar of places that had been destroyed. She had dark eyes and a smear of dust across one cheek, and she was wearing a coat 3 sizes too large that pooled around her boots. She was looking at him with an expression that contained no fear at all, and this was immediately more unsettling to KL than the Vale ship on scope. Outpost should be empty, he said. She didn't answer. Are you alone? She looked at the scope, then back at him. She had the eyes of someone who had already accepted facts that most adults were still negotiating with. KL looked at the scope, then back at her. Yeah, he said, me too. Her name, he learned over the next hour, was Mira. She had been the daughter of one of the Fenwick outpost researchers. The outpost had been abandoned 6 weeks ago when the Vale Scout patrols came through. Her father had put her in the secondary shelter with a week of rations and a handset radio and told her to wait, and she had waited 6 weeks, which said something about her character that KL found difficult to look directly at. He didn't ask where her father was. She didn't say. Instead, she sat across from him and watched his scope with complete attention, and when he began to plan, she listened. He talked to himself when he planned, a habit he'd developed alone in the field. Mira seemed to understand that she was serving as a sounding board rather than a participant, and she was very good at it. She didn't interrupt. When he said something that didn't make sense, she tilted her head at an angle that made him reconsider it. The ship will stop at the corridor perimeter, KL said. They'll have to. Their tech can't pass through the Forbidden Zone's interference, same as ours can't. So they'll deploy a forward team, small, ceremonial. They'll carry the reliquary in, open it, and he stopped, and everything stops. Mira tilted her head. I'm not trying to stop the whole ship, KL said. That's not a thing a person can do. I'm trying to stop the reliquary from being opened. Specifically, inside that zone. He paused. The coffin, the reliquary. If I can take it, keep it from them, or destroy it, or... He stopped again. I don't know, he admitted, which was not something he said often. I don't know what happens if I destroy it, if the voice is inside it. He sat back. The monks, the scholars who wrote about it, they said the voice can't be killed, can't be destroyed. It can only be imprisoned, or it can be freed, and then, he made a gesture that meant and then everything. He looked at Mira. I don't suppose you have any ideas. She looked at the scope. Then she looked at him with those ancient, unafraid eyes, and she put one small finger on the map panel on the mark for the Forbidden Zone. Yeah, KL said. That's what I figured. He traveled light. He always traveled light. The long case contained a Terran Standard carbine, a sidearm, 12 charges for each, a mono-edge blade, a roll of compression cord, 4 emergency flares, and a photograph he'd been carrying for so long that the laminate had worn soft at the edges. He added 1 extra water kit and a second ration pack, and then looked at Mira. You stay here, he said. She was already pulling on the oversized coat. He thought about arguing. He looked at the scope. He thought about the secondary shelter and 6 weeks of waiting and what that did to a person. He picked up the long case. Stay behind me, he said. Exactly behind me. If I tell you to run, you run in a straight line and you don't stop. If I go down, you keep going and you don't look back. He met her eyes. Understood? She nodded once. The nod of someone who had already made this bargain with themselves before he offered it. They moved out into the dark. The Vale advance team was 12 strong. KL picked them up on the 4 hours into the march, 12 heat signatures in a loose column, moving with the unhurried certainty of beings who had never had reason to move any other way. At the center of the column was an object that registered as a cold point, an absence of heat rather than a presence, moving like a shadow on the scope's display. The reliquary. Cale had seen Vale up close twice before, once in a controlled setting, a prisoner exchange that hadn't gone well. Once in the field, at a range where survival required absolute stillness. Both times he had been struck by the same thing. The way they moved. The Vale were bipedal, roughly human in proportion, but the similarity ended there. Their bodies were wrapped in their ceremonial plate, chitinous armor grown rather than manufactured, fused with their exoskeletons at birth. They stood taller than humans by half again. Their hands had one too many joints. Their sensory cluster. What passed for a face was a vertical arrangement of receptors that caught light and vibration in frequency ranges human bodies couldn't access. They communicated in subsonic pulses that humans felt as pressure changes rather than heard as sound. They were old, not individually. Individually they lived perhaps a century. But the Vale, as a civilization, were several 100,000 years old. And this age lived in the way they moved, in the complete absence of urgency or doubt. They had never, in their entire recorded history, lost a war. They had absorbed every species they'd encountered, or ended them, and they had done so with the serenity of something that has never been surprised. Cale lay on his stomach at the ridge above the column's path and watched them and tried to slow his heart rate by remembering the last thing that had made him genuinely laugh. It was an argument he'd had with the quartermaster at Waystation Alcott about the correct classification of synthetic algae bars. It wasn't funny. It was the kind of thing that stopped being funny almost immediately. But it was so ordinary, so specifically and stubbornly ordinary in a universe that kept producing things like this. 12 alien soldiers carrying a coffin that held the end of everything through the dark, that Cale found himself smiling slightly into the dirt. Mira, flat beside him, noticed. She looked at him with an expression that asked a question. "Nothing," he murmured. "Let's count." He counted. 12 Vale. 4 in the vanguard, 4 in the rear, 2 flanking the reliquary, and 2 at the center walking in what appeared to be a ritual formation. Slight ahead, and behind the coffin itself, hands extend, heads bowed, emitting the subsonic pulses in a steady metronomic rhythm. Priests, or the Vale equivalent. The reliquary itself was a rectangular case, 2 meters by 1, sealed with something that looked like organic matter. Vines or sinew, dark and dry, wound around the case in patterns that probably meant something to someone. It was being carried on a frame by 2 drones that moved ahead of and behind it. The drones were not guarded. Why would you guard something that no one sane would try to take? Cale took inventory of the terrain between the ridge and the column's path. He looked at it for a long time. Then he reached into his pack and took out the photograph and looked at it for a shorter time and put it away. "I need a distraction at the south end of the column," he murmured. "Something to pull the rear guard off. 30 seconds. Mira held out her hand. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Absolutely not," he said. She kept her hand out. Her expression was precise. She pointed at herself, then at the south end of the column's projected path, then mimed throwing something, then held up 2 fingers and pointed at him. He understood. She'd throw the flares. He'd have 2 of them, instead of 1 to draw the rear guard. She'd be at the south end, away from the actual action, but close enough to the column that the guards would move toward her rather than toward him. "If they see you," she pointed at herself, then mimed walking small, hunched, very small, in a pattern that was specific and practiced, zigzag, cover, cover, cover. She had thought about this. She had thought about exactly this, probably for 6 weeks in a shelter, 'cause thinking about it was the only thing she'd had to do. Cale sat with this for a moment. 20 seconds, he said. Then you run. Straight line, north-northeast, there's an arroyo 200 meters out. You get in it, and you stay in it, and you don't come out until it's quiet for 10 minutes. He held up 10 fingers. 10. Not 5, 10. She nodded the way she'd nodded before, the nod of a bargain already made. He handed her the 2 flares and the sidearm, which she accepted without apparent surprise, and he showed her the safety and the trigger. And she nodded at each step with attention rather than nerves, and then they separated in the dark with no further ceremony, because ceremony was what you did when you had time. Cale went around the long way, downslope, keeping the ridge between himself and the column until the last possible moment. He moved the way he'd learned to move in 11 years of going to places where he probably shouldn't be, which was with complete attention and without hurry. Because hurry was what got people killed. The ground was dry and pale under a sky thick with stars. The Veil ship was a dark mass at the horizon, too large to look at for long. He didn't look at it. He reached the reliquary's line of travel with 4 minutes to spare. He settled behind a rock formation at the column's midpoint and waited. The subsonic pulses of the priestwalkers pressed at his chest like a hand, low and steady. He had read somewhere that the Veil used these pulses during what passed for their worship, a communion with their gods, or their concept of gods, which was less a belief in superior beings and more a belief in superior processes, forces that had been at work before consciousness existed and would be at work after. The voice was the oldest of these processes. The voice had sung, and things had come into existence. The voice had wanted to unsing them, and so the voice had been sealed in a coffin for 100,000 years. And now 12 soldiers in a post-apocalyptic landscape were walking it to the place where its song could finally go free. Cale thought about this. He thought about the specific mundanity of it. 12 people doing their jobs. Getting up in the morning, putting on their ceremonial chitinous plate, drawing their duty weapons, walking across a dead world toward the end of all matter. It was, in a way, the most human-scale thing he'd seen in years, this ordinariness in the service of the incomprehensible, and he found it easier to be angry about than he'd expected. The first flare went up. South end of the column, exactly where he'd told her. A brilliant orange burst against the dark sky that the Veil rear guard reacted to with the speed of experienced soldiers, wheeling weapons up, subsonic pulses spiking into frequencies that Cale felt as a sudden headache behind his left eye. The second flare, closer to the first, south and slightly west, she'd thrown them in sequence, creating a movement signature rather than a static one. Smart. 3 of the 4 rear guards moved south at speed. The 4th held position, scanning. Cale came around the rock at a run. He'd thought about the priests. He'd thought about trying to take the reliquary without engaging the priests, using the confusion of the flares to simply lift it off the drone frame and carry it and run. He'd spent 40 minutes on this plan and abandoned it because it had too many moving parts and because he fundamentally didn't know what would happen if he touched the reliquary without the frame's stabilization system. And there were things in this universe it was better to engage directly rather than step around. So he engaged directly. The first of the priestwalkers reacted to him faster than he'd expected, faster than a human of similar apparent position would have, priest or soldier, spinning and producing a weapon from somewhere in that arrangement of sinew and plate that registered as thin and long and absolutely lethal. Cale broke left, felt the discharge of it pass close enough to leave static in his hair, came back around with the mono edge in his hand. The second priestwalker was behind him. There was a moment, and Cale had been in enough moments to recognize this kind of moment, where the calculus is simple. You are slower, you are outnumbered, and the logical outcome of the next 3 seconds is that you are not alive at the end of them. He'd been in enough of these to have learned something. The logic of the moment was always correct, and the logic of the moment always missed the fact that humans were deeply, specifically, stubbornly unreasonable about the ends of things. He threw the mono edge at the second priest, not to injure, to make it react, to make it move its weapon to track the blade instead of him. He hit the first priest in the 3 joints of its weapon arm with everything he had. The carbine at close range, not elegant, not the way his instructors had taught him to use it, but close and hard and twice, and then he was through the gap and at the reliquary's drone frame, and the drones, which were automated, which were designed to follow the priests, were recalculating with a half-second lag because nobody had ever taught them what to do when a human touched the frame. He lifted the reliquary off the frame. It was cold. It was cold in the specific way of a thing that had been cold for 100,000 years, a cold that was not temperature but something else, and the priest walker's subsonic pulses spiked into a frequency that drove every thought from his head for one long white second. Then his body kept moving because his body had been doing this for 11 years and had learned to keep moving when his head stopped contributing. He ran. The Vale rear guard was coming back. The remaining vanguard was moving to intercept. The surviving priest was somewhere behind him, making a sound he felt in his sternum that might have been rage or distress or the Vale equivalent of prayer. He ran with the reliquary against his chest, both arms wrapped around it, the cold of it pressing through his coat and shirt and into his ribs, like a question that didn't have a human answer. The arroyo. He found it by running north-northeast and trusting the map he'd put in his head 2 hours ago. Dropped into it, pressed against the near wall, controlled his breathing the way he'd practiced. 4 counts in, hold 4, out 4, because this was what his body needed to keep working, and his body was currently the only thing standing between the reliquary and 12 motivated Vale with a religious obligation. Silence above. The Vale were not running. They were moving with method, sweeping outward from the column's last position. They had time. They knew they had time. Something moved in the arroyo. Kale had the carbine up before the thought completed. Mira, pressed against the far wall, 10 meters down, watching him with those eyes. He put the carbine down. He closed his eyes for a count of 2. Then he opened them and moved to her, keeping low, and she looked at the reliquary in his arms, and then back at his face with an expression that contained equal parts relief and the specific assessment of a person determining whether the problem is now better or still catastrophically bad. Kale set the reliquary down between them on the arroyo floor. They both looked at it. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, we have it. We have it, and we're 3 kilometers from the forbidden zone." He looked up at the arroyo walls, calculating angles, line of sight. If they open it inside the zone, everything ends. If they open it outside the zone, it releases locally. That's bad for us, but containable. So we need it to not be opened in the zone, and we need it to not be opened at all. And the way I keep these 2 things from happening is... He stopped. He looked at the reliquary. He thought about the defector's words. The voice can't be killed, can't be destroyed. It can only be imprisoned. He looked at Mira. She was looking at the patterns on the reliquary's surface, the wound sinew, the dark organic matter that sealed it. Her head was tilted. She had the expression she'd had when he said something that didn't make sense, the expression that meant reconsider. "What?" he whispered. She reached out, touched one of the sinew patterns, didn't disturb it, just traced it with her fingertip. Then she looked at him and moved her finger along the arroyo wall. The dirt, the rock, the layered sediment of something that had been sealed for a long time. And then back to the reliquary. He understood. You don't open it, you don't destroy it. You put it somewhere it can't be followed. The Forbidden Zone's interference wasn't just a navigation hazard for ships. It was something more fundamental, a region where the normal physics of space-time became approximate rather than exact. The defector had said it. The zone is linked to the coffin's power. It was the zone that had created the conditions for the first imprisonment. The zone and the reliquary were part of the same system. If you took the reliquary into the zone, not to open it, but to put it in the deepest part of the interference field, and if the field there was what his instruments had suggested 18 months ago, something that was less like physics and more like an absence. It doesn't just seal it, Kale murmured. It reseals it, puts it back, but you'd have to get it to the center of the zone, not just to the perimeter. He looked at her. I'd have to go in. She looked at him with those ancient, unafraid eyes. The instruments couldn't function in there, he said. Navigation goes to noise. I'd be going in on dead reckoning. He paused. Alone, you stay here. She started to shake her head. The coat, he said quietly. She stopped. Your father put you in the shelter in the coat. That coat. He met her eyes. Someone is going to come out of that zone. I need it to be both of us. His voice didn't waver. He made sure of that. You stay here and you wait. I will come back. He'd said that to someone before. He'd meant it then too. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached up and put both hands on the lapels of the coat and straightened it. And this was such a specific human gesture. Someone straightening your collar before something dangerous. Someone who couldn't give you a better protection than that one. That Kale had to look at the sky for a moment before he trusted his face. 10 minutes, he said. If it's quiet for 10 minutes after I go in, you move north. There's a Terran relay beacon at grid mark 779. The handset has the frequency. You call it and you give them your name and you keep calling until they answer. She handed him back the sidearm she'd been carrying. He took it. He picked up the reliquary. The veil were closing. He could feel their pulses at the edge of audibility, that deep chest pressure getting stronger. They knew the arroyo. They'd find it within minutes. He climbed out of the arroyo and walked north. He walked fast, but not running, because he was carrying the reliquary, and because running was for when you needed to cover distance quickly, and what he needed right now was to cover distance correctly. He walked and he breathed, and he listened to the veil pulses behind him, and watched the Forbidden Zone get bigger ahead of him, a stretch of space, where the stars at the horizon didn't sit right, where the geometry was slightly off in a way that itched behind your eyes. He walked into it. The instruments died at 50 meters. He kept going. At 100 meters, the pulses behind him stopped. He understood why. The veil couldn't enter the zone with their sensory apparatus. They were waiting at the perimeter. He did not find this comforting. At 200 meters, the cold of the reliquary became a sound. He understood this was not what was happening, but it was what his mind was providing. A low, ancient tone, not unpleasant, not threatening, just very old. The sound of something that had existed before it had anything to describe, before the vocabulary of existence had been assembled. The voice, not free, asking. Kale kept walking. He found the center by the way it felt, the way the air changed, the way the interference field resolved from noise into something quieter, something that was absence rather than chaos. He stopped and stood in it and breathed, and the cold of the reliquary was in his chest and his bones, and the ancient tone was everywhere. He put it down. He put it down in the center of the absence, and he stepped back and he said, in a voice that he was aware was probably ridiculous, but that was also the only voice he had, "This is as far as you go. You understand? This is as far." The tone shifted slightly. The sinew patterns on the reliquary's surface moved, just slightly, tightening. The cold got colder. Then the interference field pulled inward, a sensation he felt rather than saw, a drawing in of the absence, And the reliquary was at the center of something that was not space and not time, and was specifically exactly what a thing that could not be destroyed needed to be in if it was going to remain not destroyed. He turned around and walked out. He walked the 200 meters back. The stars realigned themselves around him as he went, the geometry resolving back into the familiar geometry of a universe that was, however improbably, continuing to exist. At 50 meters, the field released his instruments, and they came back online with a series of complaints about lost calibration, data that he found enormously funny in a way he couldn't immediately explain. At the perimeter, the Veil were waiting. 9 of them, not 12. 3 had stayed south, presumably dealing with the distraction. 9 was still 9. He stood at the edge of the zone with his carbine in his hands and the reliquary not in his hands. And the 9 Veils stood in their row, looking at him with their sensory clusters, and the subsonic pulses they were emitting he recognized as something different from the kill hymns he'd read about. Something slower. Something that pressed against his chest, not like a fist, but like a question. Where is it? He'd been wrong about one thing, he realized. He'd thought the Veil were serene because they'd never been surprised. He was looking at surprised now. 9 very old beings standing at the edge of the thing they'd spent 100,000 years working toward, and the human with the wrong number of joints was standing at the perimeter without their cargo, and the field behind the human was still and cold and closed. Cale did the thing that made sense. He sat down in the dirt. He put the carbine across his knees. He looked up at them. He had 11 years of reading the body language of beings that didn't have the same body language as him. And what he read in the 9 Veils standing in their row was something he recognized from the mirror. The specific bone-deep exhaustion of beings at the end of something that has been very long. It's sealed, he said, not to explain. They probably couldn't process his specific frequency range any better than he could process theirs. Just to say it, just to put it into the air. It's sealed, and it's staying sealed, and the zone will hold it until whatever you'd call the end of time, which is probably significantly longer than either of our civilizations. He held their attention. So here's what I think happens next. You can kill me. I'm not going to pretend that isn't an option. Or we can both turn around and go back to our respective situations, which are, frankly, a mess for both of us, and we can decide what to do about the fact that you can't get your thing back and I can't make you leave. The pulses shifted. He felt it in his chest. Not a fist, not a question, something else, something lower and slower. Yeah, Cale said. That sounds about right. He never fully understood what happened in the next 10 minutes. Later, when he tried to write the report, and he wrote a very detailed report, because accurate reporting was the least he could offer, he described the 9 Veil as withdrawing, which was accurate, but didn't capture the specific quality of the withdrawal, the way they turned as a unit and moved north toward their ship, not with defeat, but with something that had no human word for it, a state that was perhaps the Veil equivalent of having put something down that had been very heavy for a very long time. He sat in the dirt and watched them go until they were out of sight. Then he sat a little longer because his hands were shaking in a way they didn't usually shake, and his chest hurt, and the cold of the reliquary was still in his bones in a way he suspected it would stay for a while. Footsteps behind him. Small, quick, specific. I told you 10 minutes, he said without turning. Mira sat down beside him in the dirt. She looked north, where the Veil had gone. Then she looked at the zone perimeter, still and cold and holding. The relay beacon, he started. She took the handset out of her coat pocket and held it up. Already called, already waiting. He looked at her. How long have you had that ready? She held up 6 fingers. He thought about this. 6 weeks. 6 weeks in a shelter with a handset radio and an oversized coat, and she'd had that ready. Not panicked, not hopeless. Just ready, in the order who understood that ready was the only useful thing to be. Cale looked at the sky, which was getting lighter in the east, the sun rising over a world that was, improbably, still there. He could feel the residual cold of the reliquary in his chest like a thumbprint. The memory of a sound that had been singing before there was anything to hear it. He thought about the defector's words. It can only be imprisoned. Yeah, he thought, but we've been doing that since the beginning. Putting things in boxes, naming them, sealing them, carrying them through the dark until we find somewhere to put them down. Every civilization learned this eventually, that the voice, whatever shape it took, whatever it called itself, didn't get answered. That was the human contribution to the long argument. Not the philosophy of it, not the theology, just the stubbornness. The decision to sit down in the dirt at the edge of the impossible and say this is as far as you go and mean it. The handset crackled. A Terran frequency. A voice asking for authentication. Cale took the handset. He gave his name and his code and his location. He spoke in the flat, specific voice of a report because that was what he was trained to give, and because flat and specific was what would get someone out here before the Veil ship decided to send a second team. When he was done, Mira was sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest, looking at the sun coming up over the eastern ridge. And she had the expression of someone who had accepted the fact that she was still there with the same completeness that she had accepted everything else. He thought about her father's coat. He thought about how someone puts their daughter in a shelter in their coat because it's what they have to give. He thought about ordinary things in the service of the incomprehensible. "Your father," he said quietly. She looked at him. "He would have kept waiting," Cale said. "He would have waited 10 minutes. Mira looked at the rising sun for a long time. Then she leaned very slightly against his arm. They sat like that in the growing light, a man and a child and a world that was still there, and behind them, in the cold and the quiet of the Forbidden Zone, something ancient stayed exactly where it had been put.